This stratagem is all about pre-teaching vocabulary. We've identified some selected terms that students will encounter pretty quickly when they start reading The Most Dangerous Game. So this stratagem is all about pre-teaching the meanings of these terms to students. There's actually a lot more going on here than just teaching definitions. And so before I share with you some of the other more subtle purposes of this stratagem, let me ask you a question. Have you ever had students that seem to memorize definitions almost like on a rote level? They may be able to recite the definition, but really have very superficial knowledge of what the term really means. So what we're getting at is beyond these sort of superficial understandings of terms definitions. And so another key purpose of this stratagem is to provide deeper knowledge structures associated with really understanding the meanings of those terms. A key thing that we're going to do to provide those deep knowledge structures is facilitate elaboration of the term's meanings. Elaboration basically means having the students learn to use their own language when they're discussing the term, the meaning of the term, the context of the term, and things like that. So as you'll find when we look at the Vocabulary Connections DVT, just the word connections is all about elaborating. So students elaborating on the term's definitions is really all about making connections. Another key purpose of this stratagem is we're actually going to be teaching students how to use the Vocabulary Connections DVT. So the Vocabulary Connections DVT can be used before a story is read to pre-teach some selected terms that will be appearing near the beginning of the story. Likewise, it can be used during the reading of the story so that as selected terms are encountered, we can do a little timeout from the story and unpack the meanings of those terms. Likewise, as students identify other terms that we didn't target or you didn't target, but they think are pretty cool terms, then we'll be applying the Vocabulary Connections DVT to those terms as well. After the story's been read, students can use the Vocabulary Connections DVT to basically anchor the definitions of new terms. Here's an example of the Vocabulary Connections DVT. So we'll start with noting the term, so in this case it's palpable. And the next component of this is looking at what's the bigger picture of the meaning of this term. And so this is like the superordinate concept. So this is not the specific definition of the term, but rather the larger context or the bigger picture. So basically, palpable essentially means relating to the senses, and it's an adjective. Now, the next part of the DVT focuses on the distinctive features of a definition. Now, some definitions are only one or two words, whereas others, there may be several parts to the definition or several components of the definition. And so what we're going to do is essentially dissect the definition and list each component of the definition, preferably on separate lines. And that shows how each component of the definition is its own sort of distinctive feature. So for palpable, the distinctive features would be something that is readily heard or seen or perceived. So notice how each distinctive feature is listed on a separate line. Related words can be synonyms, or they can be any other word that basically relates in one way or another to the term. So for an example, with palpable, some related terms might be noticeable or unmistakable or tangible. Real-life connections, you may have, say, 35 students in a classroom, which means you may have actually 35 different real-life connections, because what's important here is that students are making connections between the term and something real in their own world, not the world of this literature. An example of a real-life connection for palpable might be, when my friend stood up to give her speech, her fear was almost palpable in the air. She was terrified. Now, don't confuse this with just write a sentence using the term in the sentence. This is more than that. We want students to actually compose a connection of something going on in their life. The last component is called I spy the term. And basically what we're looking at here is how the term was used in text. Right now, all we're going to do is identify the sentence in which the term was used. Later on, we'll be looking at things like why the author probably chose that term as opposed to some other. So we're doing some more higher order thinking associated with that. Now, the Vocabulary Connections DVT has places for 3 different terms per slide. So when you open your PowerPoint slide of the Vocabulary Connections DVT, the terms will already be listed, and also already listed will be the bigger picture and the distinctive features for each. The reason why we've listed this here is that when students are learning these vocabulary terms, they're not just learning the definitions, they're also learning how to use the Vocabulary Connections DVT. So we're scaffolding that experience. We don't want to just jump right into co-constructing what the bigger picture is and the distinctive features and so forth. We're just going to give that to students and then move on to some easier parts of elaborating on the definition, like thinking of what are some related words and some real-life connections and noting the context in which the story used them. You will be co-constructing this part with students. Now, as you're doing that, we've also provided a sample of how this might look once it's been developed. And so we have sample related words and sample real life connections and so forth. This is not something we'd actually show students. This is what they see because we are co-constructing that information with the students. However, you can use this as sort of your guide on the side so that as you're facilitating the discussion of possible related words and real life connections, you'll have a sense of the direction to take students in.